Most people assume that growing up in a chaotic environment leaves a person damaged in ways that are mostly obvious. I'm anxious, avoidant, reactive, and while those things can be true, here is what the research also shows. The people who navigated genuine childhood chaos and came out the other side developed something that most psychologists did not initially think to look for: a specific, durable, and extraordinarily practical set of behavioral refusals, things they stopped doing, things they learned, through real experience and real consequence, never to do again. And those refusals have made them, in very specific and measurable ways, some of the least manipulable people alive. Stay with this until the very end, because the sixth thing on this list is something that most manipulation tactics depend on entirely, and people who grew up in chaos are almost completely immune to it. Once you understand why, you will never look at that immunity the same way again. The first thing people who grew up in chaos never do as adults is believe what someone says without watching what they do. Pay close attention to this one, because it is more consequential than it sounds. Most people, when they meet someone new, extend a baseline of trust that is revised downward only when that trust is violated. This is the standard social operating procedure, and it works adequately in environments where most people are operating in good faith. But a person who grew up in chaos learned something different. They learned that the gap between what someone says and what someone does is where the truth actually lives. They learned it early. They learned it from people who loved them and still could not be counted on. And so they developed a default mode that most people never cultivate. They watch, they wait, they collect behavioral evidence before they extend anything that cannot be easily retrieved. This is not cynicism. It is an empirically grounded approach to trust that makes them extraordinarily resistant to the specific manipulation tactic of saying the right thing while doing the wrong one. The second thing people who grew up in chaos never do as adults is let urgency override judgment. Think carefully about this one because it reveals something important about how manipulation actually works. The most effective manipulation tactics in existence share a common feature. They create a felt sense of urgency. You need to decide now. This opportunity closes tonight. If you don't act immediately, something valuable will be lost. For most people, this urgency is genuinely destabilizing. The brain under time pressure defaults to simpler processing. It relies on shortcuts. It becomes more susceptible to suggestion. People who grew up in chaos are specifically resistant to this because they spent their childhoods in environments where urgency was the permanent condition, where everything felt like a crisis, and many things actually were. And what that produced, over time, was a nervous system that learned to function clearly inside urgency rather than being undone by it. Artificial urgency does not accelerate their decision-making. It makes them more suspicious, because they know from direct experience that real emergencies do not usually announce themselves with sales tactics. The third thing people who grew up in chaos never do as adults is accept an explanation that doesn't account for the observable facts. Notice the precision of that because it matters. It is not that they refuse to accept explanations. It is that they refuse to accept explanations that don't hold up against what they can actually observe. This is a skill that was built by necessity. In a chaotic childhood environment, the official explanations for what was happening were frequently incomplete, frequently managed, frequently designed to maintain a surface appearance rather than to accurately account for what was actually occurring. And a child in that environment, who wanted to navigate it safely, had to develop the ability to hold the explanation alongside the observable reality and notice when the two did not align. That capacity did not disappear when childhood ended. It became a permanent feature of how they evaluate information, and it makes it extremely difficult to mislead with a plausible-sounding story that doesn't actually fit the evidence. The fourth thing people who grew up in chaos never do as adults is compromise a boundary because someone made them feel guilty for having it. This is where it gets truly important. Guilt is one of the primary tools of manipulation because it is so effective on most people. The suggestion that by maintaining your boundary you are being unkind, selfish, unreasonable, or that you are causing harm to someone who cares about you, is enough to move the majority of people. But people who grew up in chaos have a different relationship with guilt. They spent their early lives in environments where guilt was regularly deployed, sometimes by people who genuinely loved them, to override their instincts and keep them compliant with dynamics that were not safe for them. And they learned, through the specific pain of what happened, when they ignored those instincts, to distinguish between guilt that is pointing towards something they genuinely did wrong and guilt that is being manufactured to keep them manageable. They are not immune to guilt. They simply do not let it alone override what they know. The fifth thing people who grew up in chaos never do as adults is romanticize consistency as proof of safety. I pay close attention here because this one is counterintuitive in a way that most people miss. For most people, consistency in another person reads as trustworthiness. If someone is reliably warm, reliably present, reliably agreeable, the brain flags this as a positive signal: safe, trustworthy, someone to move toward. People who grew up in chaos know something about consistent presentation that most people don't. They know that the most destabilizing people they encountered in childhood were often consistent in certain registers, consistently charming to outsiders, consistently warm in the early stages, and that this surface consistency was not a reliable indicator of what lived underneath it. So they do not take consistent presentation as sufficient evidence of safety. They look at what the consistency is made of, what it does under pressure, what happens when the stakes get real, and they wait for that information before they decide what the consistency means. If this is finding something precise in you, something about how you move through the world that you have always known but never had named this clearly, this channel exists for exactly that kind of recognition. We give psychological language to the things people carry without knowing what to call them. Subscribe if you haven't already, because what comes next goes into the immunity that is hardest to manufacture and hardest to break. The sixth thing people who grew up in chaos never do as adults is respond to the performance of need as if it were the same as genuine need, and this is the one. Because most manipulation at the interpersonal level depends on triggering the helping instinct, on presenting a version of vulnerability or suffering or dependency that activates the other person's care and causes them to extend themselves in ways that serve the manipulator's goals. For most people, this is extraordinarily effective because genuine empathy does not come with a built-in mechanism for distinguishing real need from performed need. But people who grew up in chaos spent years in proximity to people whose expressions of need were sometimes real and sometimes a tool. And they developed, out of sheer necessity, a calibrated sensitivity to that distinction. They can feel the difference between someone who is suffering and someone who is deploying suffering, not perfectly, not always, but with an accuracy that most people who grew up in stable environments simply do not have access to. And this makes the standard manipulation tactic of performing helplessness almost entirely ineffective against them. The seventh thing people who grew up in chaos never do as adults is assume that the way something looks on the surface is the full account of what it is. This is perhaps the deepest cognitive legacy of a chaotic upbringing and the one that produces the most durable protection against manipulation. Most people take environments, situations, and relationships largely at face value until they are given specific reasons not to. People who grew up in chaos learned that the surface and the reality are routinely different, that families can appear functional and be genuinely dangerous, that kindness can be a strategy, that the stated reason for something is sometimes the last place you should look for the actual reason. This has made them, in adulthood, almost compulsive readers of the underlying structure, of what is actually being organized beneath the presentation they are being offered. And it means that the majority of manipulation tactics, which depend on the target accepting the surface as the reality, encounter in these people a mind that is constitutionally unwilling to do that. And the eighth thing people who grew up in chaos never do as adults is lose themselves entirely in someone else's emotional reality. Think carefully about this one because it is the one that protects them in the most intimate and therefore most high-stakes contexts. People who grew up in chaos had the experience, repeated and formative, of another person's emotional state becoming the governing reality of the entire environment. What that person felt determined what was safe, what was possible, what was required of everyone else in the space. And surviving that required developing something that psychologists call self-differentiation. The ability to remain clear about what you yourself think and feel, even when you are in close proximity to someone whose emotional experience is very large and very demanding. This does not make them cold. It makes them oriented. It means that even in the most emotionally intense relational situations, some part of them remains anchored to their own perception of reality. And that anchor is precisely what manipulation requires them to lose. Because manipulation, at its core, requires the target to substitute the manipulator's version of reality for their own. And people who grew up in chaos have spent a lifetime refusing to do that, not always successfully, but with a practice that has made the refusal the default rather than the exception. Here is what the research ultimately shows about this profile. The things on this list are not achievements these people pursued. They are adaptations that were built by circumstances no child should have to navigate. The behavioral refusals are real, and they are genuinely protective, and they exist because the alternative, the version of adulthood that did not build these capacities, was demonstrated to them early and clearly. They know what it costs to believe the words without watching the behavior, to let urgency override judgment, to accept the surface as the full account. They know because they paid those costs before they had the language to name them, and the knowledge they carry as a result is not a consolation for the childhood they had, but it is something real, something earned, something that belongs entirely to them, and that, in an environment full of people who have never had to develop it, makes them something genuinely rare. Hit the like and subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next one.